Good morning to most of you. Good afternoon to a couple of you. And from here in the US, good evening. Welcome to day 2 of this 5-day introduction to WSP auditing. And a special welcome to our colleagues from Thailand and India who are just joining us today. Let's start by quickly recapping what we did yesterday. We spent the first part of the day covering some WSP basics. We reviewed water safety plan steps and key terms, and Daryl clarified some points from the introductory course on the 29th of October. And we dedicated some time to this because a key criterion for successful auditing is that auditors are very well versed in water safety plans. So some of you are indeed WSP experts, while others are brand new to water safety planning. So we spent some time on that yesterday. We spent the second part of the day on the what, why, who, and when of WSP auditing. And our colleague Asoka told us a bit about the audit program at his organization in Australia. Australia, incidentally, has one of the most established and robust WSP audit programs in the world. It's widely considered to be a gold standard for auditing. So it was great to hear from Asoka on that. So this morning, we'll hear from another expert. Bonnie from WHO in Manila will talk with us about the budding WSP audit program in the Philippines. So although it's a much younger audit program as compared to Australia, the Philippines has done some excellent work to begin to establish a workable auditing scheme that's fully customized for their national context. So welcome, Bonnie. Could you please tell us, turn on your video and your mic if you would, and please tell us about WSP auditing in the Philippines context, including why and when it should be carried out. And let's focus on external auditing, please.
Thanks, Angela. In the Philippines, we have already a national policy on water safety plan for all drinking water service providers issued by the Department of Health in 2014. It includes a provision for WSP auditing. Our WSP external audit is conducted in 2 phases. Phase 1 auditing is done for water safety plan development process. The purpose is to evaluate compliance of the water safety plan contents to the water safety plan guidelines of the Department of Health. This phase involves 4 stages. First is the application for WSP acceptance, that's a new term, screening of WSP, evaluation of WSP, and approval of WSP. The approval stage culminates with a certificate of WSP acceptance from the Department of Health. The certificate is valid for 3 years. Phase 1 auditing is done for every new or renewal application of water safety plan acceptance. This preliminary audit process is supported by another national policy in 2017 through a administrative order of the Department of Health entitled Guidelines for the Review and Approval of the Water Safety Plans of Drinking Water Service Providers. And of course, with also a Manual of Operations issued in 2018 to guide the Department of Health key stakeholders on how to review and approve WSP. So we have a very strong regulations when it comes to water safety plan development. For phase 2 auditing, this is still under a developmental stage. This is to be done for water safety plan implementation. So we have 2 major phases, water safety plan development, and the other phase is water safety plan implementation, to determine if the implementation is being implemented in accordance to water safety plan approved activities, and if the water safety plan objectives are also being met. Phase 2 auditing has 2 components, one which is carried out annually, and the other which is to be carried out every 3 years. So every year, we are doing the water safety plan monitoring, and for every 3 years, the actual auditing. There are already draft guidelines and tools developed for phase 2 auditing, which we will be testing this year and next year in the DFAT project areas, and as basis also for the issuance of another national policy on monitoring and auditing of water safety plan implementation in the Philippines. That's all, Angela, for that portion.
Okay, thank you so much, Bonnie. It's really interesting to learn of this phased approach to auditing. teasing apart WSP development from WSP implementation in terms of how you audit. I note, correct me if I'm wrong, that the frequency of auditing ranges from annually to every 3 years, depending on the component. And I also note that there are a number of supporting guidelines and tools that have been developed in the Philippines. So now can you talk for a moment about who is responsible for carrying out auditing?
Yeah, for phase 1 auditing, the Department of Health National Policy states that there should be a 5-member water safety plan review committee who shall evaluate water safety plans and recommend approval if found in order. For phase 2 auditing, remember I mentioned there are 2 components. One component will be carried out by a DOH deputized agencies. So we have another terminology, deputized agencies, as indicated in the Water Safety Plan National Policy. And the other component is proposed to be carried out by accredited or certified water safety plan auditors. So we have still to develop specific guidelines on this as we are still in the pilot testing stage.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. And we plan to ask you a couple of more questions about who does the auditing on Thursday, on day 4. So for now, thank you so much for talking with us about external auditing in the Philippines, what you've already established and the plans that are under development. And I'm sure the participants appreciate learning about this regional example, and we look forward to hearing a bit more about it on Thursday. So thanks once again, Bonnie.
I'll appreciate that. Thanks also, Angela, for that opportunity to share our experience here in the Philippines.
Okay, so we had some time reserved here to answer some questions that you all shared via Zoom's chat feature yesterday. However, only a few questions came in, and those that did come in were inadvertently deleted due to a technical glitch. So sincere apologies if you sent a question and were not able to answer it because it got lost. And then another question that came in was about auditor certification, which is a really important question. And that's a topic that we'll cover in some depth on day 4. So I'll hold off saying anything more about that now. I will say that while we will cover the topic of auditor certification, I want to clarify that this training is largely focused on the nuts and bolts of water safety plan auditing, meaning that it focuses on what an individual auditor needs to do to prepare for, carry out, and follow up an audit, including the practical tools that are available to support auditors with those tasks. So it's not a training on how to set up a national audit program. For example, how to train and certify auditors, who should pay for auditing, how should audit findings be reported and shared nationally or subnationally. Those are all very important questions, but they're generally outside the scope of this training. That said, we will do our best to touch on these topics as time allows, and we will have some time on day 4 to talk about these things. So with that, I will now hand over to Daryl to begin to talk to us about the WSP auditing process and supporting tools that are available.
So let's turn our attention to how we actually do audits and some of the tools that help us to do this. There's 2 resources that we're going to be talking about. One is the WSP Audit Toolbox, and the other is your activity guide instructions for today. So we'll be looking at the auditing process in 3 stages. What we do before the actual audit on the site, what we do during the audit on the site, and what we do after. And let's look at what we do before, first of all. So firstly, we schedule the audit. So we decide what's the scope of the audit. Is it covering everything or just one particular focus we've got, for example? And you plan the sufficient time to cover the scope because we don't want the audit to be overly rushed. And then you prepare an audit plan. So that's where you'll be deciding, for example, who's going to participate in the audit? Which sites are you going to visit? And for example, you'll have to think of the logistics of that because it may take you, 3 hours to get to one particular site. And so if you've only got 2 days, you'll have to plan 3 hours to get there, then 3 hours to come back. So you'll have a bit of discussion between the auditor and the supplier to figure out the logistics. And then the auditor will advise the WSP team how they should prepare for the audit. The sort of things you'll cover, like, which documents will they have to get ready for review? What sort of questions might the auditor be seeking to find answers to, and so on. And probably the most time-consuming part of before the audit in this preparation phase is reviewing the WSP document in advance. And this allows the auditor to understand the system and the WSP itself. And this can help to limit the time you need on site because you've already read the document, you understand it. It can build credibility with the WSP team because you're not going to be asking questions that are obvious if you looked at the document. And in fact, you need to understand a lot of what's in there in order to establish the program and what sites you're going to visit anyway. And I know from experience, picking up a brand new WSP can be a little overwhelming because you're not familiar with the names or the places of things and so on. So you need a bit of time to do that. Right, so that's what you do before the actual on-site audit. Now, during the audit, this is what you actually do during the on-time audit time. You first of all have an inception meeting, and that's where you'll talk about the purpose of the audit and clarify any questions and expectations, and where you importantly set the tone of the audit. If you set the tone that says, I'm a real policeman and I'm going to find what you've done wrong, then you probably won't get people answering questions in an open way. So it's really important how you do that. The other thing you do is on site, you actually look at some documents that you wouldn't have seen before. You can go into detail on some of them. You can interview staff and you can have site visits. And during this whole time on site, you're taking notes. And then occasionally you'll be sitting down and you'll be assigning scores to some of the questions you've decided to ask. And as you'll soon see, there's a clear audit criteria and forms. And the purpose of this is to have a systematic process that you follow. And then the other thing you'll do during your on-site audit is you'll prepare a preliminary audit report. So you'll give the preliminary findings, and then you'll conduct an exit meeting. And this is where you discuss the major findings or impressions you have. You might clear up any misunderstandings before you give the full formal report later on. So that's during the audit itself. And the other thing is what happens after you've done the audit on site. So you, first of all, prepare your final audit report. So you get all your notes and you get all your justifications, you put them together in a report, you make sure it's going to be helpful and truthful and be following the criteria that you've decided to set. So all audits should result in a written report where you document the actors who you met and so on, the activities that you did in the report, and most importantly, you summarize the findings and the recommendations, because that's where people will be looking. What did the auditor find? What do I need to chase up? What does he suggest we do? And then, of course, there may be some follow-up needed to do all that. So you have before, during, and after. Now, what might this look like in terms of a timeline? So here we have a typical timeline, and let's say that in week 0, the audit is happening. So typically, you'd be wanting to prepare the audit plan at least 4 weeks before the actual audit on site. So during this time here, you'll be contacting the WSP team. They probably have contacted the auditor and said, we're ready for an audit, tell us what you want. So you would contact them, and then probably pretty soon after that, you would get the WSP document from them, and you'd start reading it, you'd start looking at it, start asking yourself questions, deciding what you're going to look at on site. You'd have some toing and froing between yourself and the auditor and the WSP team, deciding the logistics and so on. Finally, in week 1, you would have done all that before work, and you'll finally confirm everything. Then you actually have the audit itself, which might only be 2 to 3 days on site. And then after the audit, you then spend some time, and probably you'd be aiming for about 2 weeks, no more than 2 weeks, the final report that you would deliver to them. So that's the typical sort of timeline that you're looking for. This may sound like a lot, but there is plenty of help available. We've got the tools to support every step, and they are basically in the audit toolbox that I sent to you before. And as I said, we'll be exploring that quite soon, so you'll get to be quite comfortable with what is in there. So Angela, this audit toolbox, I've just sent a PDF to people, but is it pretty easy to find? I mean, how else can you do it? Do I have to look on the web or ask WHO for it? How do I find it?
Good question, Daryl. It's quite easy to find, actually. It's just a Google search or whatever your search engine is away. So maybe we could take a second, actually, and you can open up your search engine and I'll talk you through the process of finding it.
Okay, there we go. I've done it. I use DuckDuckGo.
Okay, I've never heard of DuckDuckGo, but it should work. Okay, so what you'll want to do now is just enter some sensible search words. So why don't you try WSP Auditing?
WSP Auditing. Okay.
Let's click that and see where it takes us.
Okay, now what do I do?
Well, the first link there, if you go ahead and click that, that will take us to the WHO page where you can download the WSP Audit Guide.
Doing that. Okay, now what?
So if you scroll down on this page,
yep,
you'll find links to various components of a WSP audit training package that was published by WHO last year. And this training package includes everything a trainer needs to conduct a WSP audit training. And one of these components is the audit toolbox, which is number 3 on your list there. So this toolbox, it's a central part of the audit training package, but it is also a very useful standalone resource for individual auditors who are tasked with carrying out an audit. So there's where you find it. All you have to do is click to download it. And I'll mention that this is in an editable format. Here, what's available through this link is in Word form so that users can download it, modify it for their context and use it.
Well, that sounds too easy. So the take-home message is you've just got to search for WSP Auditing. Couldn't be any easier. I've already downloaded a PDF version of that, and that's what I sent you before, and we'll be starting to explore that very soon. Okay, Angela, it's over to you.
Hey, thank you, Daryl. Okay, so this brings us to our first breakout activity for today. So note, everybody, that we have 4 breakout activities for today and several more planned for the coming days. So Daryl, myself, and all of our facilitators really want to make sure these sessions are as interactive and valuable for you as they can be. Here is your first discussion question. In your groups, you imagine that you work for a water supplier that's being audited. So in this scenario, you're the audited, you're not the auditor. So working in groups, you'll make a list of all the things that you would want to know as the entity being audited to allow you to prepare yourselves for this audit. What would you like to know? As usual, these instructions can be found in your activity handout, which Daryl shared at the start of the day, and this activity number is 4. So in just a moment here, Daryl will send you all to your breakout rooms. Once you're there, you'll have 6 minutes. As with yesterday, you'll receive a notice 2 minutes out that there's 2 minutes remaining. So welcome back. You found out a very abrupt end to the session and you're transported instantly back to the main room. So welcome back. For those of you who did get a chance to discuss the question a bit, you may have come up with any number of things as what the audited would like to know, but here's a couple of examples of what your group may have identified as information to know. If I were the water supplier being audited, I would certainly want to know, when will the audit start? How long will the audit last? Who will the auditor want to meet with? What staff members? Technical staff, management staff, treatment plant operators? They'll want to know what field sites will the auditor want to visit. What questions will the auditor ask? What documents will be reviewed? Water quality monitoring records, standard operating procedures, that sort of thing. And then importantly, the supplier will want to know, what do I need to do to pass the audit? What are the criteria? What are the expectations? So if you did have a chance to chat, you may have come up with a couple of these things on the list. Now, Daryl's about to launch another poll. And when he does, I'd like you to share your opinion on this question here. The question is, WSP audit visits should always be unannounced so that auditors can assess business as usual conditions for the water supplier. Do you think that that's true or false, that audit visits should always be unannounced? Daryl, could you please launch that poll? And I'll go ahead and end the poll now.
72% said false, 28% said true.
Okay, this is very interesting. This, I think, is a tricky question, and it definitely could be argued that there's no hard and fast right and wrong answer. We would suggest that this is false. And the reason for that is that auditing is a highly disruptive and demanding activity for the water supplier, requiring auditors to pull supplier staff away from their day-to-day duties to answer questions and share records, etc. So to be respectful of the supplier's time, to ensure that the key staff and the records you want to see can be accessed during the audit, and to support the best audit outcomes, clear communication between the auditor and the supplier in advance of the audit is critical. So I'll be interested, for those of you who think it's false, as the days progress and we talk more about what is entailed in an audit, if you're feeling about that changes or not. Let's see. So remember that this slide here that Daryl showed at the start of the day. So it sets out what an auditor needs to do before an audit begins. Schedule the audit, prepare an audit plan, advise the WSP team how to prepare, and review the WSP document in advance. And each of these things requires engaging with the supplier in advance of the audit. So now when you lead a WSP audit, especially your first couple of audits, you'll find that there's a lot to consider and plan and communicate. So to make the process as smooth as possible for yourself and for the water supplier, you'll want to be organized. The first couple of tools in the audit toolbox that Daryl shared are about getting organized in advance of the audit. So there's a preparation to-do list and an audit plan form, both of which can be very useful in giving an auditor, especially a new auditor, confidence that he or she hasn't forgotten any important planning steps. So now, in just a moment here, I'm going to open the audit toolbox on my computer. You don't have to open it on yours. And I'll share my screen so that together we can take a look at these first two forms, which are planning tools.
Okay, so as Angela does that and gives us a quick tour of the forms, you just think about the discussion you've just had in your groups about what the water supplier who's being audited would need to know, and consider which of the points that you discussed are being addressed in these forms.
Can everyone see this toolbox on my screen? Terrific. So this is what the audit toolbox looks like. If you were to follow that link that Daryl took us to and clicked that audit toolbox, it looks like this. So on the first page, there's this index of the forms that are available in this toolbox. There's 9 of them. Right now, I'll just briefly walk you through the first 2, the preparation to-do list and the audit plan form. First 2 forms. So if we scroll down here to the first one, this is the preparation to-do list. So this is activities to prepare for the audit. This is just a planning tool for the auditor. So the first thing here on this list is to use the audit plan form to prepare an audit plan. So the audit plan form is actually the second tool in the toolbox. So I'll just take a second and go down here to the second form, which is the audit plan. And this is just a really simple template for developing an audit plan. There's some fields up here to record the name of the water supplier, the dates, the type of audit, the reason for the audit. And an important part of this form is the proposed program. So included in this form is just an example program that the auditor would need to modify to reflect the particular plan for their own audit. And this program would just spell out the times for key audit activities, from the initial meeting to interviews with staff members and site visits. And it should spell out who should participate so that the supplier can make sure that the necessary people are available to the auditor, and the purpose for the different activities. In this particular example program, it's a 3-day program, as you can see here. So just to be aware that that tool is available, this template for use. Now, if I go back up to the preparation to-do list, so the first task here is to prepare the audit plan. The next task, and it's suggested that you do this 4 weeks in advance of the audit to give the supplier plenty of time to prepare. You share the necessary information with them, like the audit plan, and then also a copy of the scoring form. And we're going to talk about that today. But this is the scoring criteria. What questions will be asked and what's expected of the supplier? What do they need to do to score well? Then you can ask the WSP team to share a copy of their WSP with you so that you can review it in advance. And then also ask the WSP team to have the following things ready by the start of the audit. This is a list of documents that you may want to review during the audit. Certainly a hard copy of the WSP document, some water quality testing records, customer satisfaction surveys or records, and so on. So what you as an auditor may want to review will vary, but make sure you let the supplier know in advance so that they can gather those materials. And then it's suggested that 1 week before the audit, you send a confirmation email. And then before you show up to begin the audit, you definitely want to review the WSP document and answer the questions that you can from the scoring form, which again, we'll talk about a bit later. So the point here is just to make sure you know these resources are available for you to modify and use to support you when you undertake an audit. So with that, I will hand over to Daryl to begin talking about audit criteria and the scoring form.
Okay, so we're now going to be talking, just as Angela said, about the audit criteria and the audit form. And these criteria and questions are really important because you've got to make sure that the questions and the criteria you're using are very clearly defined. So it's important to have a very objective system, and that helps in making sure that the audit is impartial. And you want to be looking at both the WSP in development and in implementation. That's normally what you would assess. So I'm now going to open, if you look at this, this slide here, you'll see tool number 3 is called the scoring form, which Angela has just shown you numbers 1 and 2. I'm just going to open up the scoring form. Here's my audit toolbox. Okay. And you can see, and you've got a copy of this so you can play with this later, that the scoring form is from pages 4 to 18. So I'm going to go to that now. And this is what page 4 looks like. Here it says it's the scoring form. And there's first of all some general information about the supplier that you would fill in, and some information about the auditor. So they're pretty straightforward. Now, the next pages, and quite a lot of pages here, have a series of questions in them. So for example, this series of questions is all about the WSP team. Okay, don't worry about the questions yet. The next lot of questions are about the system description. And there's a whole lot of questions there, and a whole lot more information. And there's a next lot of questions about hazard identification and risk assessment. And you can see there's things like some questions, and then there's some tips for auditors and scoring guidance, then the score and so on. We'll come to these later on, but for now, just want you to know that it's broken up into these different sections and elements. The next series of questions are about the improvement plan, and so on and so forth. Everything you want to know about is basically there's been a suggested series of questions for a whole lot of issues, and you'll be exploring that very soon. I'm just going to walk you through an individual activity that you'll be doing very soon. What you should do is, first of all, have a pen and paper and have it handy. And I want you to just mark out really roughly on the left-hand side, numbers 1 down to 7. Okay, so I'm just going to do that as you do that. Any bit of paper, it doesn't have to be neat and tidy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and then I'm going to open the audit tool for you and just show you how that works again. So this is the question that this activity is all about. The question is got listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories of questions. This is just for your activity to get you to understand, to play with this scoring sheet. The first category is like the hazards and hazardous events. The next category is to do with risk assessments. The next one's category is control measures, then validation and operational monitoring. Now, what we're going to do is together discover which questions in that scoring form relate to these particular topics. And there will often be more than one question related to a particular topic. So that's actually the activity that you'll be asked to do, and I'm going to do a couple with you so you see how the scoring form works. So I'm just going to open up the scoring form again, and I'm going to go to scoring form. So the first thing we're going to look at is the question to do with which questions are associated with hazards or hazardous events. That's the first thing you're trying to fill out for your number 1. I'm looking at this scoring sheet and I say, WSP team, well, that hasn't really got to do anything with hazards and hazardous events, has it? So maybe the question will be elsewhere. So I keep scrolling down. Oh, here's something. System description. Does that have anything to do with hazards and hazardous events? Not really, because that's not where you do that. So maybe it'll be later. Oh, here we go. Hazard and hazard identification. So probably in this little section of the form, there'll be some questions about hazards and hazardous events. And there you go. Look, question 3.1 has a question. Has the risk assessment? No, that's got nothing to do with hazards and hazardous identification. No, it's not that one. Maybe there's another question. Here we go. Question 3.2. Have all significant hazards been identified at all major steps? Now that looks to me like it's to do with a hazardous event. So there you go. That's the question we've just found together. And I've written in there question 3.2 because it happened to be question 3.2. Okay, now, how about I'll give you another illustration and just say we're going to look at operational monitoring. So once again, we're going to look through the score sheet to see what questions would be talking about operational monitoring. So I'm just going to open up that scoring sheet again. There it is. I'm going to keep scrolling down. Now, I'm not expecting to find in this category questions about operational monitoring. It's just the wrong place. Okay, so I keep scrolling down the scoring sheet, and there are improvement plans. Would I find anything there about operational monitoring? No, it's the wrong place. Wouldn't find it there. So there we go. Here's the section talking about operational monitoring, and question 5.1 is asking questions about operational monitoring. So question 5.1 is certainly one of the answers you'd put beside that thing to do with operational monitoring. So that's how you play with the form, and the purpose of this exercise is just to get you really comfortable with what is in this scoring form. So reminder, that's what you've got to do. And number 2 is to do with risk assessments, and I'll leave that screen up while you do that. So now I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I'm putting a timer on for 5 minutes now, and then we'll come back to the room. So just do that individually. Okay, so let's just go ahead and see how we what we found there. So don't worry about if that seemed a little rushed, because you do have time to do this later on. I'm just going to show you the answers. And as long as you begin to feel more comfortable with that scoring sheet, that's what we're really after. So I'm just going to give you the answers. You may want to note them for yourself for the future. Okay, if you haven't got them, at the end of the day, we're giving you the PowerPoint handouts and you can find them again later on. So just before our break, just one more comment. As you looked through the scoring form, you were probably thinking, is this question relevant to the WSPs I know? Well, you should find that most of the questions work for almost all situations. However, sometimes you may find that it may not suit the context. So you can modify it. For example, you could look at adjusting the questions to better reflect the maturity of the WSP. So for example, if you're doing an audit that's focusing on WSP development only, you could delete the questions related to WSP implementation, because in each section you would have discovered there's a development question and an implementation question. So depending on the scope of your audit, you can adjust that. You could delete some of the questions. And perhaps it's a very mature WSP, and the questions in that case might appear very simplistic to you. So you could adjust them a little bit to reflect the water supply system complexity, but probably not very much. You would probably adjust more of those things to do with your scoring. But just a very quick warning here, take care if you're going to adjust the scores, which we'll talk about later, because this can affect the balance in the total thing. So just a warning, you can't adjust everything here. You've got to be really careful, and we'll talk about that later on. So we'll now go to a short break.
Welcome back. We're going to talk now about how an auditor should gather information to score or assess audit criteria. So there are various sources of information that an auditor must consider. Firstly, the auditor must review the WSP document itself. He or she will also review other documents and records, like monitoring records, standard operating procedures, training records. He or she will also need to ask questions of staff members. And last but not least, auditors need to ask questions, last but not least, auditors need to pay careful attention to what they see in the field, looking for similarities or differences between what they see and what's described in the WSP document. So the scoring form that we all just ticked through prompts auditors to consider those different sources of information as they assess the different questions. So let's go through an exercise where we see what happens if an auditor does not make use of all of these data sources and relies too much on just interviewing staff. Bonnie, if you're there, could you turn on your video and your mic and support me in this activity? So imagine everyone that I'm the auditor and Bonnie is the water supplier staff member that I'm interviewing. So here's the scoring form question up on the screen here that I'm interested in. I would like to know, is the improvement plan that I see in the WSP document, is it being carried out as it's documented in the WSP, and is it up to date?
Yes.
Here's one way I can try to get that information. Bonnie, tell me, is the improvement plan being carried out as it's documented here in the water safety plan?
Yes, it's being carried out in my water utility.
Okay, right. Let me ask again. I'm wanting just to understand a bit more. Has everything been completed as it's been documented here in the water safety plan? Is this schedule up to date and being implemented?
Yes, based on our records, very up to date, up to present time.
Okay, thank you so much, Bonnie, for that. Now I have a question for the group. Daryl's going to launch a poll, and we'd like to have your opinion, please. Are you convinced that the water supplier's answer that Bonnie just shared with us accurately reflects the situation? Yes or no?
27% of people said yes, and 73% said no way.
Okay. All right. I'm in the no way camp. I think that the 27% that said yes, I guess, Bonnie, you just have an honest face. So people took you at your word. I myself think that the auditor came up short in the questioning there by just asking those yes or no questions and really not relying on the other sources of information that they should refer to properly assess that question. So with that, let's get into a related group activity. You'll be going in just a moment here to the same breakout rooms that you were just in, and we will discuss the following. You will discuss the various types of information that should be collected to assess this scoring form question. It's the same question that Bonnie just answered. Is the improvement plan being carried out as documented, and is it kept up to date? This is the sort of information. This table here has categories of the different types of data sources, the WSP documents, staff interviews, and field observations. So what you'll want to do in your breakout group rooms is discuss what information that you, the auditor, can and should collect to properly assess whether the improvement plan is being implemented and if it's up to date. So consider these different data sources. So as usual, the group can refer to their handouts. This is activity 6 to see that table that I just showed with the different categories. And you will have 8 minutes in your breakout rooms.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope you found that challenging and had some good discussion. So there's a screen up there, and we'll just sort of quickly go through a reflection on the activity you just did. So remember that we're focusing, this whole exercise was focusing on question 4.3 at the bottom. Is the improvement plan being carried out as documented and kept up to date? So you were thinking about that, and you were looking at what sort of things might you do before going to site. Well, here's some suggestions of the sort of things that you probably were discussing. Okay, so you probably want to know about, look at the improvement plan and see what was being planned and when it was meant to happen. And you'd probably be looking at any timelines to see whether they are, anything complete. So the sort of thing that an auditor might want to know for the staff interviews would be to discuss the improvement plan with staff, asking them what has or has not been completed, and maybe not with those yes/no questions that our practice auditor did before. And for the field observations, be looking to see are any of these improvement plans completed, and confirm their status by looking at things. They're the sort of things that you'd probably want to be doing, and I hope that in your discussions you found some of those and agreed with some of those responses. Okay, let's move on then. This particular note-taking form we're now going to look at, so we're going to explore the audit tool a little more now. You'll notice here that it's on page 19 to 24. So I'm now going to open that up and share that with you on the screen so that in your own time you can look at it yourself. Okay, so I'm going to go right to the front again, and you'll see that I'm looking at the note-taking form, which is number 4 here, and the note-taking form is on pages 19 to 24. So I'm very quickly going to go there and have a look. Right, so that's what the note-taking form looks like. I'll just explain that a little bit to you. And there's quite a lot of pages here, but they're all the same layout. First of all, you'll see that there's a row for every question that you would have been looking at in section 3 of the form. So every row has a question, and there are 3 different colors in this note-taking form. There's the yellow ones. So we've got yellow for WSP review, and that corresponds to yellow there. We've got the, I guess it's a sort of an orange color in the middle there, which is related to interview and records. And that's got its own corresponding column over there. and then you've got field visits there. So the three columns on the left, for every question, they're going to identify at what stage of your auditing program might you need to look at that question. So for example, looking at question 1.1, it says, is there a document at WSP? And you would say, okay, well, I'd have to look at that in the WSP review phase, and maybe I'd look at that in the interview and record phase of your audit. And any notes you'd take, you'd write there. So I'm going to go down and look at another one. So I'm going to go down to question 2.1. I just keep scrolling. Here we go. Here's question 2.1. So the question 2.1 is, are intended users of the water supply defined? So what it's suggesting here is that in the WSP review phase, when before you get to the audit site, you'd be looking at that. So that's quite clear where you'd find that. And then what you would do is you'd make a note here, first of all, which page of the WSP does it do that reference and talk about that. So you'd make a quick note of that. And then you'd make some notes about that. You'd say, yes, very well defined, or no, look, they haven't even mentioned it. Can't find it anywhere. So this one here is looking only at the review phase. And then let's look at another one. Let's go to 2.3. This one here says, well, the best place to find the answer for that one would be in the review phase, drinking water quality standards described and so on. So basically, you'll find that there's suggestions for each of these different things as to when you might look for your different data sources. And I've just described that for you there. Here's another question. Question 4.3 is saying, basically, for this particular question, is the improvement plan being carried out, which is what we just talked about before? Well, you've got to do it at the review phase. Before you get to the site, you're going to have to do interviews and look at the records on site, and you're going to have a field visit. So for this particular question, you'll be writing notes on all of these columns. And remember that all of these columns, all of that information will be contributing to a score. And this is really helpful because it makes sure that you as an auditor, or whoever the auditor is, it helps you to be impartial, and you can justify anything you say. So if they say, how come you've only given me a really low score here? And you say, well, this is what I found in the WSP document itself. This is what I found when I asked people. Now that's the reason I've done it. So typically, when I'm doing an audit, I write that up in the field in really my handwriting, and then I transfer that to a Word document later, because there might be quite a lot of information there. And so when you complete this, it becomes quite long. Now, we're going to have another very quick activity, and I want you now to get ready to open the note-taking form in the audit toolbox. So as soon as you finish talking, you can go and open that. So I want you to, first of all, open the note-taking form, which is on pages 19 to 24. And then I want you to count how many questions that are in the form can be answered or scored by reviewing the WSP document alone. And that, of course, is the yellow column. So just skim through that and see how many questions you can find that are answered just by looking at the WSP document. And what we're doing here is just getting you, again, very familiar with this form.
If I look at the note-taking form and go down the list and count the questions that can be answered only with the WSP document, I think I counted 11 or something.
So 11 that are only...
Is 11 or 12?
It might be 12, 11 or 12. So I'd have to count. I'd have to count again.
We'll have to go to an adjudication.
I count twice is 12.
Okay, very good. But it's definitely not one of the options that you all were given. So that was a trick question.
Just a trick question to see really who was on the mark. Also, Ahsoka, talking about being awake, I presume you're unmuted and have your video on. I'm sure you all remember Ahsoka from yesterday. Now, Ahsoka, can you please give us your perspective, just in a couple of minutes, really briefly, on why, to assess certain WSP questions, it's only appropriate to consider the WSP document only. So what sort of circumstances might you think of that, very briefly?
Yeah, sure. So WSP document is the starting point to your WSP, and there are certain questions that are appropriate to consider only within the document, because there's no other information you can't find that other you cannot find the information other than in the WSP document. For example, in your toolbox, and this question, has the risk assessment approach been clearly described? Now, where else can you find that information? It's only in the document, right? So there are probably few other examples that will be very clear that you can only find the information in the document. So, for example, has the intended use been described? Where else can you find intended use there? Have you defined your water quality standards or compliance requirements in the document? And that's the starting point. So it's important that to note that there are a number of items that only can be appropriate to be considered in the WSP document.
Okay, thanks very much, Asoka, for just highlighting that. So just in summary, it's really important that the auditor doesn't just turn up on site and expect to have all their questions answered by asking people. You have to do, as an auditor, do your homework before you go to site. So thank you very much, Asoka.
Thank you, Daryl. While we were hearing from Asoka, and thank you, Asoka, I did recount the questions that were the activity, and I counted 12. I counted 10, and then I counted 12, and then I counted 11, and I counted 12 again. But so the point is, there are quite a number of questions, in the neighborhood of 12, that you can answer as an auditor simply by reviewing that WSP document. So like Daryl said, there's plenty that you can and need to do in the way of assessing the WSP before you show up on site. So now let's take some time to talk about field visits that are undertaken as part of an audit. So audits will generally include visits to field sites, such as water treatment plants. And to make the most of field visits during an audit, and to avoid forgetting to look for or ask for something important, be sure to plan ahead. What you don't want to do is to follow along on a tour of pipes and pumps and filters without proactively considering the information that you need and how you plan to get that information during your limited time on the site. So by the end of today, you'll be keenly aware of just how much an auditor needs to plan and prepare to do the job well. There's a lot required, but there are a lot of helpful resources available to help guide and support. So within the audit toolbox, there's a tool that's called the field visit form. So an excerpt of this form is shown on the screen here. So this form lists all of the questions from the scoring form that require field observation. And it prompts the auditor to consider what to look for and what to ask while on site. So let's look at one of these questions as an example. So imagine that you're an auditor preparing to visit, say, a water treatment plant and assess this question. Are clear, accurate, and up-to-date maps and schematics of the water supply system included? So this form prompts you to consider and to plan these things. It asks you, what will you look for while you're on site? Well, you'll look for any discrepancies between the schematic of that water treatment plant that's in the WSP document and what I as an auditor see on the ground. So when you plan for this, it'll become quite clear that when you go to the field, you need to have that schematic in your hand. You need to carry a hard copy of the WSP document with you so you can compare what's in the document to what you see in the field. And then you'll consider, what will I ask the staff when I'm there? So you may ask, can you please describe for me the flow of water from the source through the tap or at the treatment plant? Can you describe for me the flow of water through this treatment plant? So that you can compare what he says to what you see in the water safety plan. So what you don't want to do is ask the question just as it's written on the scoring form. You don't want to ask that staff member, do you have clear and up-to-date schematics? Because as Bonnie did, the supplier will very likely just answer yes. So that's not very constructive or helpful. You need to ask different questions, not the way it's phrased in the question on the scoring form. So with that, this brings us to our final breakout activity of the day. The activity is this: working in your groups, you'll discuss how you would prepare to assess the following scoring form question, the question on the next slide, when you're in the field. So the question is, this is number 7.2 from the scoring form. Are standard operating procedures up to date, and are they accessible to field staff? So to answer this question, you need to go to the field and you need to see, are these SOPs up to date? Are they up to date and are they accessible? So your task in your group session is to discuss what you would look for while on site and what you would ask staff members there to help you thoroughly assess and score this particular question. Once again, you can refer to your activity packets and you'll be looking at activity 8 for that table with the question and the fields that you should consider. So in a second here, Daryl will send you to your breakout rooms and you'll have 8 minutes in your breakout rooms before you get snapped back to the main room.
Okay, so we should be all back here now. Let's just very briefly look at hopefully reflecting the discussion that you had in your groups. The first question was, what would I look for? So in other words, what am I going to try and see with my own eyes? So the question was, are the SOPs up to date and accessible? So hopefully these are the sorts of things that you might have been discussing. You'd want to actually see if you can see any SOPs clearly displayed, for example, on the wall or near where the operator works and so on. You'd also want to be looking to see whether those SOPs are current and whether they're the latest version. You don't want to see an SOP that's like obviously 2 years out of date. And you'd want to see that the SOPs are consistent with what's in the document. So you don't want to find an SOP on the wall, which is very different to what the document which you had reviewed looked at. So that's some of the things you might look at, just physically look at and eyeball. And secondly, the sort of questions that you might ask to address this particular question. You might ask questions like this: how often are these SOPs updated? And who updates them? Because what you're trying to do is to get people to talk about them. And you'll be surprised what you find out when they start answering these open-ended questions. Can you walk me through something? And you may say to an operator, no, I want you to imagine you're going to operate the backwash. Can you show me what you do? And you would want to check whether what he's doing is actually consistent with the SOP. So there's some questions. Right, so we're almost finished. We're coming to our last slide now. So well done, and we hope that's been a very fruitful and useful day for you.